The day she filed the papers that ended Garrett Calloway's empire, she was wearing boots with dried mud on the toes. Not the kind of mud you buy at a spa. The kind that comes from walking a fence line in December, in a field that does not belong to you, next to a man who will never ask you to stay, but will always leave the porch light on. 3 months before that morning, she had been someone else entirely. Her name was Sloan Mercer, Senior Acquisitions Partner at Mercer Vance Land Holdings, Dallas, 41 years old. Owner of a penthouse on the 32nd floor of a building that cast its shadow over half the arts district. She had a standing reservation at a restaurant that did not take walk-ins, a black card she had never once declined, and a voice her colleagues described, without irony, as a precision instrument. She had never once in her adult life worn mud on anything. The man's name was Cole Hargrove. He owned 14,200 acres in Mesa Verde County, a herd of black Angus, a 10-year-old daughter named June, and a water source so old the Texas State Archives listed it by a name the Comanche had given it before any deed existed. Sloan had been sent to acquire his signature. What she did not know then, what none of them knew except Cole, was that his signature was the only thing standing between Garrett Calloway's $400 million water contract and the aquifer that 17,000 families downstream had been drinking from for 140 years. This is the story of what happens when the wrong person gets sent to the right place. Sloan arrived in Rankin Crossing on a Tuesday in a black Range Rover that the county road had not been designed to accommodate. She parked at the gate of Hargrove Ranch and stepped out in heels that immediately found the gap between two caliche rocks. She adjusted her footing without looking down. She had trained herself over a long career in places that were not built for her, never to look down. The gate was not locked. It was simply closed. There is a difference in ranch country, and she did not know it yet. She noticed the man on the tractor before he noticed her. He was cutting the engine on an old green machine, the kind that looked like it had outlasted 2 presidents and 1 drought. He climbed down without hurrying. He was wearing a flannel shirt, the color of cedar bark, and he did not take his hat off when she approached. She said the words she always said. The ones she used when the deal had not officially begun, but she needed to establish the room's architecture. She talked about the regional development consortium she represented, about the exciting opportunity that adjacent parcels were creating, about how the grown-ups in this transaction were ready to move to the next phase. She said all of it in the smooth, warm cadence that a coach in Dallas had once charged her $8,000 to perfect. Cole Hargrove listened. He looked at her for a long second. He said, "The fence line's been there since 1887. It hasn't moved." He climbed back on the tractor. She stood in the dust. She had been dismissed before. She had been underbid, outmaneuvered, stonewalled by county commissioners, and delayed by probate courts. Once memorably, a rancher in Palo Pinto County had simply stared at her through her windshield for 8 solid minutes until she drove away. She had cataloged all of those moments in a mental file she did not think about. This one felt different. Not because he had dismissed her, because he had done it without malice, without performance. The way you close a gate, not to keep someone out, but simply because that is what you do when you are done. That night, Sloan sat in room 9 of the Rankin Crossing Motor Inn, which smelled of cedar and old carpet, and something she would later understand was live oak smoke from a neighbor's burn pile, 3 lots over. She opened the Vista Grande purchase agreement for the first time in 3 months. She had signed it on page 38 without reading page 24. Page 24 described, in language that was technically accurate and practically invisible, a provision granting Mercer Vance the right to redirect surface flow from a spring identified only by its hydrological survey coordinate. The language used the word adjust. It used the phrase minor infrastructure modification. It had been drafted, she would later learn, by a contract attorney who had billed 190 hours to make those words say exactly what they said and nothing more than that. She looked up the coordinate. It matched the blue line on the county aquifer map, the line that ran east through Hargrove land before it reached anywhere else. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a while. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she drove to the Tilden County Courthouse and pulled the deed history on Hargrove Ranch herself. She did not send an assistant. She did not make a call. She sat at a wooden table under fluorescent light and read, page by page, back to 1887. The land had never been sold, not once. Not a single acre in 137 years. There was a note in the margin of the 1962 transfer document, handwritten by a county clerk whose name had faded to initials over the decades. It said only, "Water flows east. Always has." Sloane folded the page back. She stared at the wall for a long moment. Then she drove back to the ranch. Cole was in the south pasture with a fence post driver when she found him. She was wearing different shoes. She had not planned to walk this far. The land did not care what she had planned. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, I'd like to talk about the water." He set the driver down. He said, "So would I." He walked her to the rise above the eastern pasture and pointed. The spring came up from the rock like the land was exhaling. Clear, slow, cold. Not dramatic. Not the kind drive 3 to 3 hours, just continuous. The kind of thing that does not draw attention to itself, because it has never once had to compete for relevance. Cole said, "That spring has been running since before the state of Texas existed. My great-grandfather found it. Grandfather built the house 60 feet from it so my grandmother would never have far to go in the morning." He looked at her sideways. "Garrett Calloway wants to reroute it into an Austin municipal contract. At full draw, the hydrologist his firm hired says the spring runs dry inside 7 years. Sloane did not say anything. "I know about the clause on page 24, Cole said. "I had a lawyer pull the filing 6 weeks ago." She turned and looked at him directly. "Then why are you still talking to me?" He looked out at the water for a moment before he answered. "Because you're the first person they've sent who came back the next day without a contract." That was the first real conversation they had. Inside the house, June was at the kitchen table, doing arithmetic with a pencil she had chewed to a soft curve at the eraser end. She looked up when Sloane came in and studied her with the frank, unhurried assessment that only children and very old cattlemen apply to strangers. "Are you the lady who's going to buy our ranch?" June asked. Sloane said no. June said, "Good. Biscuit's buried by the oak tree and we can't take her." Cole poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. He set one in front of Sloane and sat down across from her. He did not offer sugar. He did not make small talk. He waited until she was settled, and then he laid out what he knew the way a man lays out tools before a repair. One thing at a time, in the order they would be needed. The original survey filed by Mercer Vance with the Texas Water Development Board listed the spring's output at 40% of its actual flow. By that figure, Calloway's team had been able to classify the proposed diversion as a minor adjustment rather than a major reallocation. That classification had allowed them to skip the public comment period entirely. 17,000 downstream property owners had never been notified. The whole architecture of the deal depended on a number that had been wrong by design. Sloane wrapped both hands around her cup. She said quietly, "I didn't know that." Cole looked at her. "I know you didn't." She did not ask how he knew. She did not need to. The fact that she was sitting in his kitchen, that she had come back, that she had walked across a field in the wrong shoes to do it, was its own kind of answer. She drove back to Dallas that evening. She did not call Garrett. She did not return the 2 messages from the acquisitions team asking for a timeline update on the Hargrove signature. She drove the 3 hours with the radio off and let the hill country unroll behind her in the rearview mirror, the cedar giving way to the Brazos Valley, the valley giving way to the flat-lit grid of the city. She sat at her desk at 10 o'clock that night and pulled every document Mercer Vance had filed on Vista Grande in the past 8 months. She found the falsified survey on the 3rd page of the Water Development Board submission. She found the backdated easement language on the 9th. She found, in an internal memo she had not been copied on, a note from Garrett Calloway to the firm's outside counsel dated 14 months prior. The subject line read, "Contingency, Hargrove non-compliance." The memo described a plan to pursue eminent domain through a public-private water infrastructure consortium in the event that private negotiation failed. It named the state official who had agreed to facilitate the classification. It outlined the legal mechanism that would be used to designate the taking as a public benefit action. It was precise, practiced, and thorough. It had 2 signatures at the bottom and a date stamp and a small embossed seal. Sloane printed it. She read it again with both hands flat on the desk. She had worked for Garrett Calloway for 9 years. She had closed 41 deals. She had sat in rooms where the conversation was not always clean, and she had told herself, in each of those rooms, that the results justified the architecture. She had used that word, architecture, because it was a cleaner word than the alternative. She had filed the alternative away in a place she did not visit. She looked at the memo. She looked at the date. 14 months ago she had been in Portugal. She had come back tanned and rested and walked straight into the Vista Grande briefing. She had taken the deal at face value because the numbers were good and the timeline was clean, and Garrett had put a hand on her shoulder and said she was his best closer. She had not asked where the spring went. She had not asked what happened to the land downstream. She had not asked. That is what she sat with at her desk at 11:30 at night, in a building that cast its shadow over half the arts district. Not the shame of not knowing, the shame of not asking. There is a distinction between the two that most people in her position never have to examine. Not knowing is an absence. Not asking is a choice. You can dress not asking in the language of efficiency, of delegation, of trusting your team, of staying in your lane. Sloane had worn all of those garments over 9 years. They were well tailored. They fit perfectly. She had closed 41 deals and called it successful. She had heard sentences in rooms she did not repeat to anyone, and she had called that discretion. She had used that word, discretion, because the alternative required her to look at something she did not want to see. She looked at it now. She thought about the boardroom, the 43rd floor, the glass and oiled walnut and the view of downtown that had once made her feel she had finally arrived at the right altitude. She had sat at that table for 9 years and called it professional. She had not asked why a spring with measurable output of a certain magnitude had been classified as a minor infrastructure modification. She had not asked for the background file. She had not asked what a hydrological survey coordinate referred to when it appeared in a property easement clause. She had not asked because asking would have slowed things down. She had not asked because Garrett Calloway had put a hand on her shoulder and called her his best closer. She had not asked because being the best closer meant not asking certain questions. She understood, at 11:30 at night, in a building that cast its shadow over half the arts district, that this was not a flaw in Garrett's system. It was the system. The next morning she was back in Rankin Crossing before the courthouse opened. Cole was at the feed store when she called. He answered on the second ring. She said, "There's a memo." He said, "I know." She said, "How?" He said, "Barton Finch. He runs the feed and tacked at south end of town. His nephew worked in the state land office. He made a copy before they cleaned the files." There was a silence between them. Sloane said, "Cole, if I bring this to a federal attorney, if I turn over everything I have, I'm finished at the firm." He said, "Yes," she said, "and Garrett will go after my license." He said, "He'll try." Another silence. "Why should I?" she said. Not as a question to him. As the kind of question you ask only when you already know the answer is going to be expensive. The kind you ask out loud because you need to hear yourself choose it. Cole said, "Because you already know. You just need to hear yourself say it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Where is Barton Finch?" Barton was 76 years old, lean and deliberate, with a way of moving through his own store that suggested he had arranged every item in it with personal thought. He wore a canvas apron and looked at Sloane the way a man looks at weather he has not yet decided whether to trust. He said, "You're the Dallas woman." She said, "I am." He said, "Garrett Calloway came through here 5 years ago. Same suit, different year. Tried to buy Cole out directly. Cole said no. Calloway said he had other methods." He paused. He was not a man who rushed into the next sentence. My nephew Darnell worked in the state land office 2 years running. He made a copy of the file before they cleaned the cabinet. He left it to me before he passed. I've been waiting 7 years to put it in hands that would know what to do with it. He went to the back room. He came back with a brown envelope, soft at the corners from years in a safe behind a row of old sale records. He handed it to Sloane. She took it in both hands. Inside was a photocopy of a meeting transcript, the date, the parties, the subject, the 2 signatures, the embossed seal of the Deputy Commissioner's office. Every element of the contingency plan, recorded and signed before a single shovel had touched the Vista Grande soil. She read it once standing up. Then she sat down in the nearest chair and read it again. It was a clean piece of work, in its way, the kind of document that only exists because someone was confident it would never surface. The contingency plan did not use the word force. It used the phrase alternative acquisition pathway. It did not say take the land. It said facilitate public benefit infrastructure access. The language was so carefully constructed that a person reading it without context might have believed it was a routine planning document. Sloane had written sentences like that herself, not about eminent domain. But she had written clauses designed to mean one thing to the person signing and another thing to the person drafting. She had called it precision. She had called it contract craft. She set the papers on her knees. She looked at the wall of the back room, which was covered in sale records going back to the early 70s. The same handwriting for decades, the same ledger format, the same care with numbers that did not belong to a corporation. Her fingers were steady. She made sure of that. She said, "Mr. Finch, I need to take this to Austin at—" That's why Darnell made a copy. He did not smile, but something in his face settled, the way ground settles after a long rain when it has finally absorbed all it can and goes still. That afternoon, Sloane drove to Austin. She had the number of a federal attorney she had met once at a land use conference in San Antonio 3 years prior. She had kept his card because of something he had said at the end of a panel discussion, offhandedly, as people were gathering their things. He had said, "The easement is never just about the land. It's always about the water. Follow the water." His name was Raymond Okafor. He was in his office. He told her to come. She drove the 3 hours in silence. No rehearsed sentences, no list. Just the road and the river that ran alongside it, low from the summer, still moving. The hill country passing outside the window in long, patient stretches of cedar and limestone and sky. Okafor read the memo in 90 seconds. He set it down on the blotter. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Ms. Mercer, if you are prepared to testify and to provide internal documentation as a cooperating witness, we can file by Wednesday." Sloane said, "I can have the documents to you by tomorrow morning." Okafor studied her. He was a man who had spent 20 years watching people make decisions under pressure, and he knew the difference between someone who had decided and someone still deciding. He said, "You understand what you're giving up." She said, "I understand what I was taking." He did not ask her to elaborate. He opened a file. On the drive back north, she called Cole. She said, "We file Wednesday." He said, "I'll have the deed records ready." A pause on the line. She said, "Cole." He said, "Yes." She said, "I signed a document I didn't read. I closed deals I didn't question. I spent 9 years in rooms where I knew the air wasn't clean, and I told myself the numbers justified it." He let that land. He did not rush past it. He said, "I know." She said, "I just needed to say it out loud." He said, "That's the first step. The second one is Wednesday." That night in room 9, Garrett called 6 times. She watched the phone vibrate on the nightstand and did not pick it up. She sat on the edge of the bed with the brown envelope in her lap and thought about a sentence she had said 8 months ago to a junior analyst in the Mercer-Vance boardroom. The analyst had raised a small question about the Vista Grande timeline, a fair question, in retrospect. Sloane had looked at her across the table and said, without pausing, without registering it, "The grown-ups are handling this now." She had used that sentence. She had taken it from Garrett, who had used it on her in her first week at the firm, in a tone that had made her work harder for 3 straight years to prove she deserved to be in the room. She had absorbed it the way a child absorbs the rhythm of a parent's contempt, not as a lesson in cruelty but as a lesson in how power sounds. And she had passed it forward. She sat with that for a long time. In the morning, Cole knocked on the door of the motel at 6:15. He handed her a cup of coffee through the open door, and they stood on the concrete walkway and watched the sky go from charcoal to peach behind the live oaks. June was at a neighbor's house in town. Pancakes, a pony, and a slow morning. She had been promised all three. They drove to Austin together in Cole's truck, the briefcase wedged on the bench seat between them. Somewhere south of Marble Falls in the gray early light, Sloane said, "My father went broke twice. Once when I was 9 and once when I was 15. He raised me on a phrase, never love anything that can't appreciate and value." Cole kept his eyes on the road. She said, he meant it as advice. He thought he was building armor. Cole said, "My wife wrote her graduate thesis on aquifer conservation. That's how we met. I was a junior. She was a senior. She asked me if I understood what was underneath my own land, and I said I thought I did. She said, 'You think, that's the beginning.'" He pulled the truck onto the highway. Her name was Margaret, 4 years gone. Sloane looked at the river alongside the road, low from the summer, still running. She said, "She would have hated me in September." Cole said, "She would have waited." It was the first smile of the drive that had nothing to sell. The filings went in at 9 in the morning. 3 documents simultaneously at the clerk's office of the Travis County Civil District Court. The civil complaint, Sloane's sworn affidavit as a cooperating witness, and the sealed packet of 47 pages of internal Merce-Vance correspondence, proving that Garrett Calloway had personally directed the falsified survey, the buried easement clause, and the eminent domain contingency plan. Every element assembled over 14 months with full knowledge of what it would do to the spring and to the land downstream. By noon, the Dallas Financial Press had the story. By 2, Mercer-Vance had lost 38% of its market value. The board removed Garrett Calloway at 3 by one. Garrett cast the one dissenting vote against himself. The FBI opened a formal file at 4:30. The shell entity holding the Vista Grande contract dissolved within 10 days of the filing. Cole and Sloane walked out of the Travis County Courthouse together in the slanted light of a Wednesday afternoon. They did not speak for a full block. The city moved around them, its ordinary Wednesday business, a food truck, a cyclist, 2 law students with coffee cups. And none of it felt like the world Sloane had inhabited a morning ago when she walked into the clerk's office with a briefcase and a sealed packet and a decision that had taken the better part of 3 months to fully become. They crossed Congress Avenue. They found a coffee shop with a tin ceiling and old wooden floors and a table by the window where the afternoon light came in at a long angle, and they sat down. Cole put his hands around his cup. Sloane put her hand flat on the wood beside his. Neither hand moved. After a while, Cole said, "What happens to you now?" She said, "I don't know. The board may ask me to lead the cleanup." He said, "Will you?" She looked at the street outside for a long moment. She said, "I'm thinking about something else." He did not ask what. He looked at her the way he had looked at the spring that first afternoon. Present, patient, not pressing. She said, "I've been thinking about what I would have done if I had read page 24 before I signed." He waited. She said, "I think I would have signed it anyway. I think I would have told myself it wasn't my department." Cole turned his cup slowly in his hands. He said, "Margaret used to say that conscience isn't a switch, it's a muscle. Most people never use it enough to know it's there." Sloane looked at him. She said, she was right. 3 weeks later, she announced the founding of the Mercer Land Conservation Trust, a nonprofit chartered under Texas law, funded by her whistleblower settlement, her savings, and the proceeds from the sale of the penthouse. $38 million in initial capital. Its stated purpose, to acquire and protect family ranches at risk of corporate acquisition, and to place at-risk aquifer systems under permanent conservation easement. Vista Grande was its first acquisition. Garrett Calloway was indicted on federal charges in November. Barton Finch was called as a witness. He wore a string tie his late wife had chosen 40 years before and answered every question in the same unhurried cadence he used in the feed store. When he stepped down from the stand, Cole was waiting in the hallway. Barton put a hand on his shoulder. He said, "Margaret would have been proud, son." Cole could not find any words. He nodded once. The spring received state-level protective designation in December. No diversion would ever be filed. The Austin water contract was reassigned to a coastal desalination project, where the engineers confirmed it should have gone from the beginning. Sloan moved into a small house on the south end of Rankin, crossing the second week of December. Yellow door, east-facing porch. A neighbor's rooster that started at 5:15 and did not negotiate. She liked all of it. She was not ready yet for what the space between her house and Hargrove Ranch might become. She understood that about herself. She did not rush it. She spent the first week in Rankin Crossing, relearning how to be in a place. Not passing through it, not assessing it, not calculating what it could become with the right infrastructure investment, just being in it. She walked the 2 blocks to the diner at 6 in the evening, sat at the counter with a cup of coffee, and watched the town open up around her. She learned the names on the trucks in the parking lot of the feed store. She learned that Hollis Vance, who ran the hardware 2 doors down, had an opinion about every type of fence post manufactured since 1970 and would share all of them if you gave him a reason to. She did not feel efficient. She did not feel productive. She felt, for the first time in a long time, like a person in a place rather than a function in a system. On Wednesday evenings, she walked up the long gravel drive and sat down at Cole's kitchen table for supper. He always set 3 plates. June always talked enough for 4 people. One Thursday, June decided to teach her how to tie a halter knot, the real kind, the kind that holds against a fence post and releases with 1 tug. 2 loops through the back, not a city knot. Sloan laughed, a clear open laugh, her head tipping back against the porch post. Not contained or managed or redirected. Cole watched from the kitchen window and did not look away. On a clear afternoon a few days before Christmas, Cole was walking the fence line between Hargrove Ranch and the Vista Grande parcel, which now belonged to the trust. He had a coil of wire on one shoulder and a fence post driver in his hand. The sky was the high cold blue that belongs only to Texas in December. This was the same stretch of fence where Sloan had stood 3 months before in city heels and a tailored blazer and described his pasture as her future parking lot. She came down the dirt road in her boots, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town. She handed him one. They worked without speaking for almost an hour. She held the wire taut against the cedar posts while he drove them deeper into the caliche. Her hands had the early marks of real work on them now, small calluses at the base of her thumbs from weeks of fence wire and post work she had taken up without being asked. When the last post was set, they straightened up together. They looked west across the pasture, toward the rise where Comanche Spring ran cold and clear and older than the state itself. Sloan said, "Cole, I don't know what this is yet." He set the post driver down. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "It doesn't have to be anything yet. Land doesn't rush." She nodded once. She did not look away. And then the sound of small boots came up behind them. June was leading the old mare by the halter, braids swinging, cheeks pink from the cold. She walked straight between them, slipped her right hand into Sloane's left, and her left hand into her father's right, and turned the 3 of them gently to face the spring. The water was still moving. It had always been moving. It would keep moving long after the fence, and the wire, and the names on any deed. And whatever name anyone eventually gave to the thing that had been quietly building between a yellow door and a porch light left on through the night. Cole felt his daughter's fingers tight around his. He felt on her other side the woman who had arrived in September with a contract and a closing timeline and a voice trained to fill the whole room. She was still there. In boots, in December, holding on. He did not let go, neither did she. Some things you acquire, some things you earn. And some things, the oldest and deepest, you simply learn, slowly, one winter fence line at a time, to be worthy of. The story of Sloane Mercer and Cole Hargrove is a work of fiction. The characters, the ranch, and the corporation depicted here are invented. However, the mechanisms at the center of this story, buried easement clauses, falsified hydrological surveys, the quiet corporate targeting of rural water rights through eminent domain contingencies, are drawn from documented patterns that appear repeatedly in real land acquisition disputes across the American West and Southwest. Texas groundwater law is among the most complex and consequential bodies of property law in the United States. Families have lost land over pages they did not read. Springs have been dry for decades that once ran year-round. If this story made you want to read a contract before you signed it, it did its job. There is a sentence near the end of this story that I have sat with since writing it. Cons isn't a switch, it's a muscle. The difficulty with that metaphor is that it requires you to admit the muscle exists before you can start using it. Most of us spend years in rooms where the air is not entirely clean, and we find a way to call it climate control. We use the word architecture because it is tidier than the alternative. We tell ourselves our department ends at the edge of our desk. The moment Sloane sits alone at her desk at 10:30 at night and finally reads the document she signed 3 months ago is not a dramatic moment. It is quiet. The screen is bright in a dark room. No one is watching. That is the point. The most consequential choices rarely announce themselves. They arrive in empty offices, late at night, when the only audience is the reflection in the laptop screen, and what that person chooses to do next determines everything. This script was assembled, shaped, and finished by a human editor who believes the most important line in any deal is the one you almost skipped, and the most important thing a spring is not who holds the deed above it, but whether it is still running. The water is still moving. It always has been. The question is never who owns it. The question is always what kind of person you become by the time you finally understand that you never did.